Are you wrestling with God today? Or have you wrestled with God in the past? Do you think that wrestling with God can be a holy moment? Could it even be a practice of worship? Hi everyone, my name is Gabby Brown. I am a seminary graduate, a wife, a mother to two daughters, a fantasy lover, and an aspiring writer living in Eastern Tennessee. Welcome to the first video of what I am calling the Divine Wrestling Mat. You might hear that name and you might think, what the heck is the Divine Wrestling Mat? Well, I'm glad you asked to let me explain. So, I have spent my entire life growing up in the church, and for a good chunk of my childhood, that included being a pastor's kid. And in all of my years in the church, I have not seen a movement quite like the one that I have seen in recent years. What's this movement, you may ask? It's a movement that's centered on the ability to ask questions, to bring doubts and concerns within the space of the church, within the space of the Christian faith. Oh my goodness, I have my baby laying down here. There's been this preconceived notion in the church, I think, especially within traditional Christianity, that to ask questions about God, to bring up doubts about the faith, about the institution of the church, about Christianity in general. Oh, bless you! To bring up these questions and these concerns, it means that you have a weak faith, it means that you have little faith. It means that there are things that should not be done if you want to have good faith. And while I certainly admire a desire to adhere to the truth, I think this hard rigidity to asking questions has created two paths moving forward, especially within the past recent years. I think we can see the negative effect of this rigidity to asking questions in the dozens and dozens of stories of people who have walked away from the faith, or the sin scandals that have come out, or the wave of deconstruction that has come around. I'm sure you can think of stories of some of the pastors and influential Christian figures, writers, musicians, actors, all these people who have almost refuted Christianity because of their own personal struggles and wrestlings within the faith. And when I look at these stories, I think it's clear to me that when believers, even non believers, are not given the space to ask questions, to wrestle faithfully with topics in scripture and in the faith as a whole, faith actually deteriorates, especially if believers are not able to wrestle in these spaces and with these topics with other believers, fellow brothers and sisters who will take their hands and guide them through scriptures and through tradition and through doctrine. Faith just doesn't stand a chance. In several of his letters, Paul says things like, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ, or gently correct each other and bring each other back into the faith. We can't do those things if we don't actually allow people to wrestle with the questions and the doubts and the concerns that they have. But on the flip side, when we allow people to do this, I think there is a chance for a lot of fruitfulness. And when I think of these positives, I am immediately, as a reader, drawn to the several books that have been released or are being released within the past few years that cover this topic. I can't tell you how many recommendations come up on my Amazon page for books just like this. So I'm thinking of books like Blessed Are the Spiraling by Levi Lusko. I'm thinking of books like The Benefit of Doubt, How Confronting Your Deepest Questions Can Lead to a Richer Faith by Craig Rochelle. I'm thinking of books like I Have My Doubts, How God Can Use Your Uncertainty to Reawaken Your Faith. I Want to Trust You, But I Don't by Liza Turkhurst. And I've been reading through this one right now called Can I Say That by Brenna Blaine. The subtitle says How Unanswered Questions Lead Us to the Real God. And there's just several of these types of books coming out. And I just want to put a slight disclaimer in here that I have not actually read many of these books. They've just caught my attention, especially in what I've been thinking about and some of the thoughts that I'm putting out in this video. They've caught my attention because all of these books seem to claim that bringing your questions, bringing your doubts into your relationship with God, into your relationship with the church and with other believers actually has the ability to deepen your faith, to make it more intimate. So maybe in the future we can actually dive into some of these books together and we can dig into this claim about how questions can lead us to God, how concerns and doubts, no matter how big they are, can actually allow us to have a more intimate relationship. But aside from everything that I see in the world, whether positive or negative, I think ultimately we have to turn to the scriptures and see what it says about us being able to wrestle with God. And for my own personal study, if you have not caught my bias already, I would argue that scriptures actually do encourage us to wrestle with God and to not shy away from our doubts and our questions and our concerns. So let's just go ahead and dig in. We are going to be turning to Genesis 32, so if you have a Bible, you are more than welcome. I would actually highly encourage you to turn there with me. So if you are unfamiliar with the story of Jacob in Genesis, Jacob is one of the patriarchs of the Jewish faith and therefore also the Christian faith. At this point, Jacob has been on a roller coaster of a ride. If you are familiar with the story of Jacob and Esau, Jacob stole his brother's birthright, stole his inheritance as firstborn son. He has completely wronged Esau of everything that the culture at the time said would be his. And he has run away in order to escape his brother's wrath. But now, after several years of living in a different country, Jacob is coming back. He's going to have to confront his brother Esau. And before he confronts his brother, this is what scripture says that Jacob does. The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the day has broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, What is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, Please tell me your name. But he said, Why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore to this day the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip to the sinew on the sinew of the thigh. After that reading, we have a featured guest because this one does not want to nap. All right, so let's dig into the scripture together. To be honest, this story has actually been one of high interest for me in the past few years, which might seem interesting because it's such a small little story in the midst of a lot of popular Sunday school Bible stories. But let me tell you why it's interesting to me. As we're talking about the theme of wrestling, I think this story, above almost every other in the Bible, is a direct encouragement to us to be able to wrestle with God. I mean, God physically comes and physically wrestles with Jacob in this story. The key part of the story that I want to focus in on is when God changes Jacob's name. When he changes Jacob's name, he says, What is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. And the implications that this has for the rest of the story in the Bible and for today are enormous. Because what we will see, especially as we get into Exodus and Numbers, is that the people of Israel, the people that come through Jacob's line, who are known by his name, will become people who wrestle with God and with man constantly. They wrestle with God in the desert. They wrestle to obey. They struggle to follow. They struggle to have faith. They have a hard time remembering his faithfulness in the land of Egypt and his deliverance from that slavery. But they also wrestle with men. They struggle to not fall into the idols that other men and other cultures around them have. They have physical struggles with wars and battles. Israel is just caught up in this wrestling with God and man. And what I think that scripture is getting at here is by saying that Jacob strived with God and with man and prevailed, is that ultimately Jacob fell in line with God. Ultimately, Jacob fell in submission to God. Ultimately, he allowed God to rule over his life, not man. So even though it looks in the story like perhaps God let Jacob win, ultimately it's God who's the victor. And Jacob only won that victory because God's victory was already won. The second interesting part about this story is that Jacob then asks for God's name. And God responds with why do you want to know my name? And then just pretty much blesses him and disappears. In this moment, if I were Jacob, I would just be utterly confused. I would wonder what the heck had just happened. Who was this person? Why wouldn't he give me his name? But no, Jacob turns, he glorifies God. He says, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." This is the other important aspect of wrestling, the one that is actually the most precious. Wrestling invites us to be intimate with God. Wrestling invites us to come into God's space and become face to face with Him, to become so close that we can see the details, that we can get to know Him, that we can breathe the same air as Him, that we can then be transformed by Him. Transformed as we wrestle with Him, as we physically, spiritually, mentally, emotionally are refined by his character. In short, wrestling brings us into the presence of God. But if you're not quite convinced by this story, let's turn a bit further into the Bible and let's see a story of somebody else struggling. So I'll be turning to the Gospels, and in particular, I will be turning to the book of Luke. So if you've not figured it out already, I'm about to set up how Jesus is the perfect wrestler, the one who shows us how to wrestle perfectly. And initially hearing that, you might say, Gabby, that's like borderline blasphemy. Why would Jesus wrestle with God? But we actually see this multiple times within the Gospels. The most prominent being Jesus being on the cross saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? And leading up to those moments of his death, Jesus wrestled. He wrestled with God, he wrestled with man. And I want to focus in on his time praying in the garden. So this is what it says in Luke 22, starting in verse 39. And he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and knelt down and prayed, saying, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation." Now, I don't know about you, but when I read that someone prays so hard that they sweat drops of blood, that sounds a lot like wrestling to me. Jesus prayed so fervently, so earnestly, that he was sweating drops of blood. But the unique thing about Jesus and his wrestling was that he did not have to wrestle with God in order to become more like God. He's not like us. He's not like Jacob. He wrestles differently. He, instead of wrestling for himself, he wrestles for us. And I think we see this particularly in the way that the Apostle John writes his prayer in John 17. So in John 17, Jesus prays for unity. He prays for unity for his current disciples. He prays for his disciples to be one as him and the Father are one. He prays for future disciples to be one as him and the Father are one. And he prays for the future disciples to be one with him and the Father. Jesus was willing to wrestle with God. He was willing to go to the cross and die for us so that we might have that opportunity to become more like God, so that we might have that open invitation to wrestle with him. Because at the end of the day, any spiritual, physical, emotional, mental strength is not going to help us wrestle. We are sinners. When Jesus found us, we were enemies of God. So there's nothing that we can do for ourselves that's going to help us win a wrestling match against God. So we must depend on the perfect image bearer who is Christ. We must submit ourselves fully to Jesus just as he submitted himself to the will of the Father. And this ultimately takes wrestling. You were not born in the spit image of Christ. You were not born with all of his character. And that's a good thing, because otherwise you would be God. And I'm sure, like me, you would make a really bad God. And so to grow in his character, we have to wrestle. We have to wrestle with a God who is refining us, who is pruning us, who is growing us, who is cultivating and nurturing us to be better image bearers. So to sum it all up, I'm calling this channel the Divine Wrestling Mat because I'm inviting you to wrestle with me. I can promise you I'm not going to do it perfectly. Slight small scene change if you haven't caught the drift. this channel is going to be fairly casual because I'm a stay-at-home mom with a toddler and a baby, so we're just going to keep it casual around here. But in summary, my prayer for this channel is that maybe these small videos can encourage or challenge you to move into a space, to move into a space where you can press in and be intimate with God, where you can bask in His presence, and where you can seek to see Him face to face. I want this to be a safe place where we, as brothers and sisters, and perhaps unbelievers too, can ask our big questions, can bring our doubts, can bring our concerns, and then can turn to Scripture and walk alongside each other and point one another to God, not to our feelings, not to our circumstances, not to the answers that we want, but to God Himself and to His character and the character that we might need to grow in. So I think there are two ways for now that I am going to plan on doing this, just kind of as an experiment. So Monday, I think for now, I'll post some videos about what I'm studying in Scripture. And in these videos, I want you to, and in these videos, I want to encourage you to study Scripture in perhaps maybe a bit of a different way. When I say that, I mean, I don't simply want to come to these passages, come to the books of the Bible, and look for answers or a quick application or the meaning of a passage. Those things certainly have their place in Bible study, but there are far better teachers in your own churches and online that can do those things really well, and can show you how to do those kinds of studies. So I would encourage you to look for those types of teachers and leaders in your church, maybe some other YouTubers online who are good at that. And instead, I want to focus on looking for God within Scripture. I want to look at Scripture and see His character, and particularly the characters that maybe might not align with ours, the characteristics that we might need to grow in, where we need to be encouraged to let some other things go so that more fruitful things can thrive. Remember, part of the reason of wrestling is not only so that we can grow closer to God, but so that we can become more like Christ. And on Wednesdays, I want to try to post some short devotional videos about wrestling with things in everyday life. The quote unquote wrestling with man kind of thing, wrestling with the mundane, wrestling with topics, wrestling with culture, those kind of things. And for now, I think I want to do a series of for I think I want to do a series for what I'm calling the hospital wrestling series. So to provide some context, from the middle of September to the end of October of 2024, I was on bed rest in the hospital for my second pregnancy. I'd already had one preterm labor and one NICU baby with my first, and I was attempting to prevent, though unsuccessfully so, prevent another preterm labor with my second, who you saw earlier. So during my 6 weeks in the hospital, my faith was probably put through the biggest wrestling match I think I'd had to date. And so, what these devotionals will be are some of my thought processes, some of my questions, some of my grievances, my laments, my joys and celebrations of what I experienced in those 6 weeks in the hospital. So if you know anyone who's in the hospital who might need some encouragement, who might need some comfort, some support, some challenging, I would encourage you to maybe send some of these links their way as they come out, particularly if you know of any pregnant moms in the hospital, because as I said, these little devotionals will kind of be told through that lens of my experience on being on bed rest in the hospital while pregnant. So I think that's where I'll leave it for today. If you're interested in taking this journey with me, if you have some wrestlings of your own, some questions, concerns, if you want to see more videos like this, maybe about things that you yourself are wondering about, put some questions, comments in the comment section below. So maybe I have some ideas of things that I can make in the future. And for now, I hope you come back and join us for sessions on the wrestling mat.